Good evening, everyone. Here we are in the third forum in our spring session in 2012. Ethan Kegley is going to talk about William James, Pragmatics, Freedom, and Will. Is that right?
Yep.
Who's William James? He is an American philosopher from the turn of the 19th and 20th century. He was a very highly educated person. He was a medical doctor, but he never practiced medicine. He worked with psychology and philosophy. He's also famous about writing on psychology of religious experiences. In philosophy, he's famous for the theory of pragmatics, or the pragmatic theory of truth. He was born in New York, 1842, died in 1910. So it has been more than 100 years since his death. Well, I won't talk more. Ethan, please give a speech about William James.
Thanks. And for those of you who are not, who don't know much about William James, I'm going to give a little bit of a background of the ideas that he described. One might ask a lot of questions about my motivations for giving this speech. This is the first speech I've given on a philosopher. And I really only have one person to thank, and that's Alex. So, thank you, Alex. So, I'm going to start with empiricism. I feel like the best way to move from, before we get into what is pragmatics and what was James's ideas on freedom and will, I want to talk about pragmatics, because empiricism, because one of James's things was called radical empiricism. So empiricism is defined as a theory of knowledge which asserts that knowledge comes only or primarily via sensory experience through the five senses. The English term empiric derives from the Greek word beautia or ibidia, which is cognate with and translates to the Latin experimentia, from which we derive the word experience and related experiment. So before William James, there was a man named John Locke. They have some similarities and some differences, but John Locke worked very hard to talk about what empiricism is. John Locke said there are two sources for our ideas: sensation, the five senses, and reflection on those senses, thoughts, memories. In both cases, a distinction is made between simple and complex ideas. There are simple ideas about sensation, and simple and complex with including sensation and the reflection on those sensations. So, simple ideas are broken down into primary and secondary qualities. Complex ideas combine simple ones and divide into substances, modes, and relations. I think for a clear understanding of that, we'd have to actually look into Locke's writings. But according to Locke, our knowledge of things is a perception of ideas that are in accordance or discordance with each other. I know it's kind of strange, but if you can understand that, then you kind of understand what he's getting at with empiricism. So James goes another step further to talk about radical empiricism. James starts with sort of saying that experience includes both particulars and relations between those particulars. So in the same way as Locke was saying, sensation and reflection. But he goes another step further with his pragmatic idea that because experience includes both particulars and relationships between particulars, therefore they both deserve a place in our explanations, not just sensory data and not just feelings or reflections on that sensory data, but both. Okay. So let's give a quote from James. Any philosophical worldview is flawed if it stops at the physical level and fails to explain how meaning, values, and intentionality can arise from that. So he's saying if you only look at sensory data, if you're only looking at what you can see and hear and touch, then it's not going far enough. And to be part of philosophy, it actually has to include the meaning, the values, and intentionality. So this is moving a little bit more into what it means to be pragmatic in terms of philosophy. James says, the only things that shall be debatable among philosophers shall be the things definable in terms drawn from experience. So, including both sensory and relationship to those sensory relationship to that sensory data. Okay. So James differs from Locke in that, James differs from Locke and Hume. Locke and Hume saw experience in terms of things which first must be interpreted before action can be taken. James said that our experience is not just a stream of data. It is a complex process that is full of meaning. We see objects in terms of what they mean to us, and we see causal connections between phenomena. So again, he's just more sort of describing the same thing, how both our senses and our thoughts, memories, and feelings about those are really intertwined with each other. So according to James, experience has both a content, say sense data, and a reference. And empiricists from before usually just tried to reduce experience to bare sensations. So that's where James differs with his radical empiricism. Talking about radical empiricism, William James wrote an essay called Does Consciousness Exist? In 1904, just 6 years before he died. In that, he denies the fundamentality of the subject-object relationship in philosophy. It's a little bit complicated. I'm going to use both Bertrand Russell's thoughts on William James and William James's quotes from Does Consciousness Exist together. Try to get an idea. So Bertrand Russell says about William James's essay, Does Consciousness Exist? The distinction of mind and matter, the contemplative ideal, and the traditional notion of truth all need to be radically reconsidered if the distinction of subject and object is not accepted as fundamental. As William James said, they are not fundamental. So Bertrand Russell at least agrees that William James was partly right on this matter. Russell had a little bit of a problem Russell had a little bit of a problem with James's use of the word experience. I'll get onto that in a second. So now quoting from James from Does Consciousness Exist? And this is I can see why Bertrand Russell had a little bit of a problem with this, because it's really hard to understand. But James says, consciousness is the name of a non-entity and has no right to a place among first principles. Those who still cling to it are clinging to a mere echo, the faint rumor left behind by the disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy. He said, there is no aboriginal stuff or quality of being. contrasted with that of which material objects are made out of, out of which our thoughts of them are made. Russell says what he's really trying to do is deny that consciousness is a thing. This is important. It's thing in quotation marks. So consciousness is an idea, not a thing. James says there is only one primal stuff or material out of which everything in the world is composed. He calls this stuff pure experience and describes it as the immediate flux of life which furnishes the material to our later reflection. I mean, it's kind of as if everything is happening and we experience that, and that's our relationship to it. He's saying it's not consciousness itself. That's a separate idea. Russell, like I said, he doesn't really agree with James's use of the word experience when James talks about pure experience. Russell goes on. Bertrand Russell wrote this book called The History of Western Philosophical Thought, and he critiques James. It's only a few pages, but though he doesn't agree with the choice of the word experience, and he goes on to list a few reasons why, like things like how can we understand what's on the dark side of the moon and stuff like that, or tree falling in the woods with nobody around to hear it or see it. But he does agree with James's radical empiricism. So these ideas form the base of James's pragmatism, where he says the value of any truth is utterly dependent upon the use to the person who holds it. And truths emerge from facts, but they dip forward into facts again and add to them. Facts again create or reveal new truth, and so on indefinitely. So whereas a fact, he goes on to say, the facts themselves, meanwhile, are not true. They simply are. Truth is the function of the beliefs that start and terminate along them. He was a really, I guess to be able to talk about James, you have to understand sort of the line of thinking that he was going on. You'd have to understand this guy that came before him named Peirce. And Peirce and James both sort of came at this idea of what is truth and what is knowledge from a very mathematical sense, a very yes and no, ones and zeros kind of thing. And that's what helped create their sort of pragmatism. The value of any truth is utterly dependent upon the use to the person who holds it. So, what does it mean that truths emerge from facts, but then they dip forward in facts again and add to them? That really reminds me of a speech that we had from David Pendry, where he talked about, remember the name of his speech? It was the Aesthetics Ethic, and was talking about how people create stories and how cultures create stories and meaning and stuff like that. So it reminds me of that. So a belief was true if it worked for all of us and guided us expeditiously through our semi-hospitable world. That's what James says about belief and truth. So from here, because I want to talk about freedom and will also, I'm going to move on to those. most of the speech has been quotes so far. I'm going to give some more quotes, but this next part about freedom and will has far fewer quotes. So I'm going to be struggling through this. To get at the core of how James understood these ideas of freedom and will, we have to look at determinism and indeterminism and see how he related those ideas to freedom and will. So, determinism and indeterminism. Determinism, which mainly followed ideas of religion throughout history, began to have support in philosophy. Philosophers started to talk about such things as social class, family heritage, geographical location, race, creed, sex, etc. All of these things could be shown to have a deterministic influence on one's life. Determinism is broken down into subcategories like causal determinism, logical determinism, theological determinism, biological, and even cultural and psychological determinism. One of the things that James did was he helped to really kind of define a lot of these words, get really into the definitions of these words. And, you know, for a long time people just believed, okay, God created the world, God created us, and everything is already sort of fated by God's hand. So he coined these two words, hard determinism and soft determinism. Hard determinism is a view which holds that some form of determinism is true, whatever, causal, logical, theological, biological, cultural, psychological, some form of determinism is true, and that it is incompatible with free will, and therefore that free will does not exist. That's hard determinism. On the other side, indeterminism. Champions of indeterminism like to use the word free will to describe a force which acts upon their choices. Free will is described as the ability of agents, say people, or groups of people, to make choices free from certain kinds of constraints. That seems pretty simple. James, like Locke as well, thought that it was a mistake to put these ideas of freedom and will together in the defense of indeterminism. So whereas a determinist on one side might have a lot of different reasons for saying that life was determined, theological, say, or biological, or cultural, or psychological. Whereas on the other side, you had kind of the indeterminist saying, well, we have free will. And in a way, James said, okay, though I don't agree that free will should be used as a phrase, he did say, if I do have will, the first thing I will myself to do is be free. Is that what he said, or is it the other way around? If I do have will, the first thing I will myself to do is to be free. Or if I do have freedom, the first thing I use my freedom for is will. Anyway. So both James and Locke thought that these ideas of freedom and will did not necessarily belong together. James believed that these two ideas were not fundamentally interconnected, that freedom seemed to describe one way of action and will a complete other way of action. Though the interactive parts within these ideas come into contact with each other, they are not to be thought about as a connected pair. Okay, so James is sort of laying it down, saying you can't use the phrase free will as an argument for indeterminism. And then he goes on to talk about how you can make a case for indeterminism. So, like you said, James was born in 1840s, right? Died in 1910. And James had read Darwin. Darwin's something on species, origin of species. And James really liked, let's see, I'll just read this. So not long after Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, James was giving us his ideas of freedom and will. James picked up on Darwin's ideas of random mutations and thought they could describe random encounters and events quite well. So James had this idea of chance, and this probably also comes from both him and Peirce being, very into math and science. James was more into psychology, but Peirce was very into math. So this idea of chance and random encounters created a base for James's belief that life was made up of both determinate and indeterminate factors. Freedom is our ability to make mistakes and find new paths without choices or our will interfering. James knew very well of the determinist arguments and fully agreed that a lot of our life was determined by a wide range of factors. Things like biology, psychology, things like that. But he also understood that the randomness of pure chance still played a part in the shaping of the entire world and ourselves as individuals. So he talked about hard determinism and he talked about soft determinism. He says soft determinists or compatibilists like Hobbes and Locke and Hume said, James went one step beyond the soft determinism of Hobbes, Locke, and Hume by saying that it was not enough just to say that determinism and free will were compatible, but that the words freedom and will needed to be redefined. Freedom, as described by James, was a set of values on a timeline, with values for chance as part of freedom. I wish I had a graph right here. It'd be a lot easier to show you instead of describe it. I can try to describe it though. So freedom is one set of values on a timeline, like an individual's timeline or a family's timeline or a group of people's timeline. While will was another set of values on the same timeline, and often showing deterministic characteristics in the will. Elements of both freedom and will exist in every individual's life. So, I'm almost done with the speech, actually. And William James said this. I'm going to get onto a few quotes at the end. William James said this while talking about chance as indeterminism. The stronghold of the determinist argument is the antipathy to the idea of chance. This notion of alternative possibility, this admission that only one of several things may come to pass, is, after all, only a roundabout name for chance. James used to lecture at, where did he lecture? At Princeton or something like that. I can't remember. No. Yeah, I think that's information is here. Anyway, after his lectures, he would talk about just walking home as being a game of chance. He asked, what is meant by saying that my choice of which way to walk home after the lecture is ambiguous and a matter of chance? It means that both Divinity Avenue, one road, and Oxford Street, another street, are called but only one, and that either one shall be chosen. Sorry, I'm going to read that again. It means that both Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street are called but only one, and that one, either one, shall be chosen. Can you hear James's ideas of pragmatism in that argument? Saying it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I mean, it matters in that you have the freedom to choose, but that it doesn't really matter in the end because they both lead to the same place. So just to finish, we can kind of get an idea of who James was. What did he do? James was the first thinker to enunciate clearly a two-stage decision process with chance in a present time of random alternatives leading to a choice. So chance and choice, which grants consent to one possibility and transforms an equivocal, ambiguous future into an unalterable and simple past. That's a lot of big words. But basically saying that you have both chance and choice. There is a temporal sequence of undetermined alternative possibilities followed by adequately determined choices. Lots of chance, also plenty of choice. James's two-stage model effectively separates chance, the indeterministic free element, from choice, an arguably determinate decision that follows causally from one's character, values, and especially feelings and desires at the moment of decision. So, that's it. I hope my discussion on William James's idea of pragmatism, freedom, and will have given you a little bit better idea of what they are. That's it.